Hello, friends. I'm your host, Dave Layton, and welcome to Signs of Our Time, discovering America's heritage, one sign at a time. This podcast is designed to provide the story behind the story found on America's roadside historical signs.
Standing outside the post office in Willmington, North Carolina, is a rather unassuming historical marker dedicated to Father Thomas Frederick Price. I wonder how many times each day people pass by and just don't notice the sign or don't know the story behind the story. Father Price is honored as one of the founders of the Maryknoll Fathers, a Catholic missionary society. But I know him for another chapter in his life, and one that directly impacted me even today. Father Price was also the founder of a Catholic orphanage in Raleigh, North Carolina. I was one of the children in the orphanage during the late 50s until the mid-1960s. When one hears the word orphanage, it likely conjures up images associated with poor, destitute, undernourished, and neglected children without living parents or other relatives to care for them. Although this is sometimes true, in many cases it's not. Many children in orphanages had parents who, for several reasons, are unable to adequately care for them. Our Lady of Nazareth Catholic Orphanage was one such institution. It began in September 1899 and continued over years as part of a missionary outreach of its founder, Father Thomas Frederick Price. The initial staff included his sister, Margaret Price. She later became Mother Superior of Nazareth and was known as Mother Catherine. 3 other sisters worked with her in the early days. It was Father Price's vision to start a seminary to train young priests for missionary outreach in the North Carolina region. As he traveled through the region, he saw a desperate need to assist the abject poor families. He came across many families that were unable to provide enough shelter, food, clothing, and education for their children. He was determined to help as he was able, so he established an orphanage and training school for the boys of such families. Early in his time in Raleigh, he traveled around the area seeking suitable property. The decision came down to 2 tracts of land. One was located east of Raleigh in the Gardner area, and the other west of Raleigh, overlooking what was at the time North Carolina State College. The choice was made to purchase the western property and to name it Nazareth. The orphanage started as a shelter for boys, both Catholic and Protestant. It was part of Father Price's vision that by showing compassion to orphans from the community at large, there was likely to be a greater acceptance to the Catholic faith. He maintained his goal of training young men for missionary work and felt that establishing the orphanage could help support that effort. The original orphanage building was a large and run-down 3-story mansion. Although it was in a major state of repair, it was salvageable. It was repaired and renovated with large rooms to include a library, a dining room, workroom, and sleeping areas for the staff and children. In 1902, Father Price opened a missionary training house at Nazareth as a preparatory seminary. It was for the education and formation of priests for mission efforts. From 1902 to 1909, Father Price taught and directed the seminary. Father Price departed Nazareth in 1911 to help establish a missionary society. He later traveled to China, where he died of appendicitis in 1919. Father Price departed Nazareth in 1911 to help establish a missionary society. He later traveled to China, where he died of appendicitis in 1919. And then in 1955, his remains were moved to the crypt below the Maryknoll Seminary Chapel in Ossining, New York. Although the orphanage was originally for boys, girls were accepted in 1927. What follows is an excerpt from the History of the Sisters of Mercy of Belmont, North Carolina, 1869 to 1933. Plans are now being formulated for the greatly enlarged orphanage as exists at Nazareth today and Bishop Haffey was eager to see this work completed within the year 1927, as indeed it was. On December 8, 1927, he had the happiness of consecrating the new buildings. The orphan girls, who since 1894 had been cared for by the sisters at Belmont, were transferred to their new institution on the Tuesday following its dedication. The buildings at Nazareth were erected at a cost of $400,000 and were free from debt upon completion. This financial feat was accomplished by the good management of Father George Woods, who succeeded Father Thomas Frederick Price as superintendent in 1906. At its peak enrollment during the Great Depression years, the orphanage housed as many as 250 children. In addition to their spiritual and academic work, they worked at farming, bookbinding, and publishing. The property, along with donations from the community, provided food and other resources for the orphanage. The property grew to approximately 600 acres. It included fields and a lake. The orphanage had several names over the years: New Nazareth, Our Lady of Nazareth Catholic Orphanage, and Nazareth House. In 1900, the United States Post Office Department established an official post office on the orphanage grounds and named it Nazareth, North Carolina. Mother Superior Catherine was appointed as the first postmaster, or I suppose postmistress would be more accurate. The post office was discontinued in 1956, but it remained active from 1958 through the mid-70s as Nazareth Rural Station. By the way, one of the memories I have as a little boy was working in the post office. I was helping stuff envelopes with a small magazine that was published as a fundraising activity. Well, the main building of the orphanage was expanded in 1915 with an addition on the east side between the main buildings and the chapel. At some point before 1925, a priest's house was built across from the main building. In 1927, the campus was expanded. A west wing was added to the main building in the same Gothic castle style. A small kitchen was attached to the west wing. The east wing was also added. It consisted of a large 3-story boys' dormitory and a 2-story school building. The buildings were joined with covered sidewalks known as arcades. These buildings remained until the site was cleared in the late 1970s. The chapel at the orphanage was originally known as the Holy Name of Jesus, or Holy Name Chapel. Later, it became known as the Church of the Holy Name of Jesus. On December 13, 1938, the church was dedicated and renamed the Father Price Memorial Chapel. It remained in use until 1977. The size and age of the Nazareth facility made it very difficult and expensive to maintain. Changes in philosophy concerning children foster and adoptive care also began to move emphasis away from the group home concept. In the mid-60s, the population of children began to be lowered, and they moved to the new facility across the way from the original facility. The new facility was designated for smaller numbers of children and featured semi-private rooms instead of the traditional open bay concept. Once the move was complete, the original buildings remained largely vacant. Later, the boys' building was used as the Tammy Lynn Center for a brief period in 1972 before being demolished. A combination of age, disrepair, and vandalism resulted in the decision to demolish the buildings. No narrative documenting the history of Nazareth would be complete without dedicating a portion to the Sisters of Mercy. Their tireless and selfless service is memorable. The Sisters of Mercy were founded by Catherine Macaulay in 1831. Catherine Macaulay was born in Dublin, Ireland, in September 1778. Over the years, she was influenced by the economically poor and opened the first House of Mercy in Lower Baggot Street in Dublin, Ireland. In 1887, it was a place to shelter, feed, and provide education for women and girls. In December 1831, she and 2 companions took vows of poverty and became the first Sisters of Mercy and dedicated her efforts to service to the poor. She continued with her efforts until her death 10 years later. When she died in 1841, there were 150 Sisters of Mercy. In addition to moving to several other countries, a group of sisters came to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1843. They branched out from there and by 1854 had established schools and hospitals in several cities in the United States. The Sacred Heart Chapel and original convent were built in the early 1900s and remain at the time of this history. They are the cornerstone of the South Central community, the headquarters for the Sisters of Mercy in Belmont, North Carolina. In 1929, more than 5,000 sisters formed the Sisters of Mercy of the Union, which dissolved in 1991 to form the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. Someone once said that we are a product of all the decisions we make in our lives and are greatly influenced by the decision of others. As I look back on the history of Nazareth and think about its founder and those who served there, I see this as a reality. If for no other reason, we see two individuals, Thomas Frederick Price and Catherine McCulley, in different time periods and on different continents, bringing their faith, passion, and vision to convergence outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. Unknown to these individuals, their efforts impact children for generations to come. The following is an excerpt from the book, The Tar Heel Apostle, written in 1944. Only a few boys had been received for the opening, and perhaps it was just as well, since the flooring in many rooms had not yet been laid. Another oversight the newcomers discovered was that their pastor had forgotten a small detail: food. There was not a particle of it on the property. Two parishioners from the Sacred Heart Parish who had accompanied the Sisters of Nazareth noted the empty pantry, and they drove back through the streets of Raleigh on a begging tour. Late that evening, they returned to Nazareth well laden with flour, sugar, bacon, cornmeal, and hams. When they had explained their purpose in the city, several merchants gave food in sufficient quantity to start the little establishment. The furnishings of the orphanage were extremely simple. Packing boxes and cases were used for tables and chairs, but the youngsters were infinitely better off under the devoted care of the priest and the sisters than they had ever been in their former surroundings. The food was coarse and plain. The boys were carefree and happy, and not hungry. I think that last sentence summarizes my experiences at Nazareth. Certainly, we might have had a better life, or perhaps what some felt is a normal life. But I can attest that in my case, I was much better cared for and given a chance at life because of Nazareth. North Carolina State University purchased the property where Nazareth stood in 1986 and built the Centennial Campus. I had a chance to travel to Raleigh area several years ago and took time to visit Nazareth. My heart was saddened as I saw that the property was being used by the university, and virtually all signs that the orphanage had been there were now gone. It seemed like another life as I think back over my time there. At the time, only a vacant, overgrown, and debris-strewn area beneath the power lines remained where the main and girls' buildings stood. The boys' building is now a driveway and a parking lot. The fields located behind the orphanage were covered with various university buildings. As I stood there looking around, I could clearly see the buildings in my mind and hear the voices of the children. I remember riding bicycles, roller skating on the sidewalks, playing hide and seek, climbing trees, and all the other activities of well-established and cared-for children. Today, the Holy Name of Jesus Cathedral stands where the Catholic Center and Cardinal Gibbons High School stood. This is the next chapter in the storied history of Nazareth that began so many years ago by Father Thomas Price. As I think back, I am in awe of what it must have taken for the administration and staff to make Nazareth successful. From the vision and tireless efforts of Father Price and those associated with these efforts in the early days, to the constant upkeep from our maintenance men, to the shepherding efforts of the priests and sisters, it must have been a Herculean effort. Across the front of the sanctuary in our chapel was a mural depicting Jesus sitting on the edge of a well and children gathering around him. Every time I read Matthew 19:14 and other such passages, that's the image I have in mind. The passage says, "But Jesus said, 'Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven.'" Well, indeed, that passage underscores the mission of the orphanage and the vision of Father Thomas Frederick Price and those who served over the many years.
Well, friends, there you have it. A story behind the story from America's historical signs and markers. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to subscribe and continue listening as we bring more episodes about the rich heritage of our great nation. Please share this podcast with others. If you have interesting stories about historical signs and markers, email me at americanhistoricalmarkers@gmail.com. That's americanhistoricalmarkers@gmail.com. Maybe your story behind the story will be featured. I'm your host, Dave Layton, and thank you for listening, and safe travels